He looked away for 60 seconds. When he turned back, his daughter was crying in the arms of the janitor, and in that moment, everything the billionaire thought he knew about love, power, and trust began to unravel. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Harris Tech penthouse office, casting golden stripes across the polished floor. The room, sleek and modern, was mostly quiet except for the soft hum of city traffic 30 stories below. 5-year-old Emily Harris sat cross-legged on a plush blue rug in the corner, humming to herself while brushing the tangled blonde hair of her favorite doll. Her father, Matthew Harris, stood at the massive glass wall, his phone pressed to his ear as he discussed a high-stakes merger with a board member from Tokyo. His voice was low and clipped, focused and sharp, the voice of a man who built an empire from code and charisma. He had brought Emily to the office that day because her nanny had called in sick, and the backup couldn't arrive in time. Normally, his daughter didn't come anywhere near his work world, a world of suits, numbers, and constant pressure, but today, she had been unusually quiet and content just being near him. He had smiled earlier, watching her draw quietly, thinking maybe, just maybe, he could be both CEO and father without something falling apart. He turned away from the window to grab a report from his desk, still deep in conversation. It only took a moment, a single breath of distraction. Behind him, Emily had decided to bring her doll over to the water cooler. She wanted to show her baby how it worked. In her tiny pink sneakers, she tiptoed over, holding the doll up high like a prize. But her foot caught on the edge of a chair leg. There was a sudden, sharp cry, the dull thud of a small body hitting the ground, and then, silence. Matthew froze. The phone slipped from his hand and clattered to the desk. In that soundless second, before he could even turn around, someone else had already moved. Rachel Morris, the building's janitor, had been mopping just outside the glass door of his office. She was a woman few noticed, brown hair tied back messily, plain uniform, eyes tired from years of surviving more than just long shifts. But Rachel noticed everything. She had seen the little girl walking near the chair, sensed the imbalance, and moved before her mind even fully caught up. By the time Matthew whipped around, Rachel was already kneeling on the floor, her arms wrapped around a sobbing Emily. The child clung to her shirt, her small face buried in the woman's chest, gasping through tears. Rachel murmured soft, shaky words, a mix of instinct and memory, while rocking Emily gently, her hand protectively cradling the girl's head. Matthew stood motionless for a moment, not understanding what he was seeing. His daughter. A stranger. Touching her. Holding her. His first emotion wasn't gratitude, it was panic. He strode across the room, his voice rising. What the hell is going on? Get away from her. Rachel didn't flinch. Her eyes met his, steady, calm, strangely fearless, and then she looked back down at Emily. She fell, she said softly. She was scared. Emily whimpered and gripped Rachel tighter, refusing to let go. Something in Matthew's chest twisted. The anger in his voice faltered as he looked closer, not at Rachel, but at his daughter's face. The tears. The panic. The comfort she had found not in him, but in a complete stranger. And for the first time in a very long time, the man who had built firewalls and fortunes, who had calculated risk with terrifying precision, stood completely unprepared. Not for a business move. But for something far more human. His daughter, broken and crying, had instinctively run to someone who had nothing, and everything, she needed. Matthew didn't sleep that night. After the incident in his office, he had taken Emily home early, skipping 2 meetings and canceling a dinner with international investors. The girl had eventually calmed down, curled in his lap on the way home, but she never spoke a word about what happened. She wouldn't even let go of the doll Rachel had quietly placed in her hands before she left. That gesture stuck with him, the quiet way the woman had handed over the toy, almost like a mother handing over a piece of herself. As soon as Emily was asleep, he called security. He demanded a full report. Who was this woman? How did she get access to his daughter? Why wasn't there any barrier between his child and a complete stranger? But the report was unimpressive. Her name was Rachel Morris. 29 years old. Employed by a subcontracted janitorial company for the last 6 months. No criminal record. No complaints. No red flags. Still, Matthew wasn't satisfied. Something about her unsettled him, and it wasn't just the way she had held Emily. It was the way Emily had held her back. The next morning, he asked to speak to her directly. Human Resources arranged a private meeting. When she walked into the small conference room on the 22nd floor, she didn't look intimidated. She didn't fidget, didn't apologize, didn't act like someone who had crossed a line. She simply walked in, nodded politely, and waited. Matthew studied her in silence for a moment. Her uniform was clean but worn. Her shoes looked too thin for winter. She didn't wear makeup. Her hands were dry and red from cleaning chemicals. But her eyes, deep brown and direct, met his with a quiet confidence that caught him off guard. "I want to know why you touched my daughter," he said, his voice even but firm. She was on the floor. Crying. Alone, Rachel replied without hesitation. "I did what anyone decent would do." "You're not trained for childcare," he said. "I wasn't caring for a child. I was comforting a person." There was no hint of defiance in her tone, just a raw, undeniable truth that cut through the room. He leaned back, folding his arms. "What's your background?" She hesitated only briefly. "I grew up in the foster system. 12 homes. A lot of moving. Got pregnant at 17. My son died before his first birthday. I finished high school through night classes, but college was out of reach. Been working since." Matthew blinked. "Your son. I'm sorry." Rachel nodded, but said nothing. There was a long pause. "Why are you still working as a janitor?" he asked. "You seem intelligent. You speak well." She gave a small, tired smile. "Life doesn't always give you the ladder. Sometimes it just gives you the ground." Matthew felt the weight of those words settle heavily in the space between them. For a moment, he saw something else behind her calm, grief, yes, but also dignity. The kind of dignity that doesn't need to speak loud because it has already survived more than enough to be heard in silence. "She held on to you," he said finally. "My daughter. She doesn't even like the nanny, and yet she clung to you." Rachel looked down, her voice soft now. Maybe she saw something she recognized. Pain knows pain. He didn't know how to answer that. The meeting ended without resolution. She left the room exactly as she had entered it, quiet, composed, unshaken. But Matthew didn't return to his office right away. Instead, he sat at the empty table, staring at the chair she'd just left, wondering how someone who had lost so much could still carry that much gentleness. He felt something unexpected begin to rise inside him, not suspicion, not concern, but something almost like shame. Shame that he had judged her by her uniform. Shame that his daughter had run into someone else's arms because he hadn't moved fast enough. Shame that someone with nothing had done the one thing he, with all his power, had failed to do in that moment, comfort his child. Matthew found himself increasingly distracted in the days that followed. Meetings blurred together, emails went unanswered longer than they should have, and his focus, usually sharp as a blade, kept drifting back to a woman in worn sneakers and the sound of his daughter's sobs echoing through his memory. There was something unfinished in him now, something unsettled. The more he thought about Rachel's story, the more questions began to form, stubborn and quiet, gnawing at the edges of his concentration. He wasn't the kind of man who left questions unanswered. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, long after the executive floor had cleared out, Matthew sat alone in his office with a laptop and a drive full of internal reports. He'd asked for access to any hospital records his corporate charity arm had touched over the past 10 years, citing an audit. In truth, he was looking for one hospital in particular, the one that had failed Rachel's son. She hadn't named it, but from her employee file and the dates she mentioned, he triangulated the city and the year. It took 2 hours of cross-referencing charitable grant recipients with regional data, but eventually, he found it, St. Vincent's Children's Medical Center. It was a reputable hospital, one that Harris Techa's foundation had donated millions to. On paper, it had high performance ratings and excellent neonatal care stats. But digging deeper, Matthew discovered a pattern, a series of internal complaints filed around the time Rachel's son would have been admitted. Whistleblower reports. Allegations of cost-cutting measures and rushed discharges. At first, nothing concrete. But then he found it, a redacted case file buried in a medical ethics board review, listed only as Patient A, male infant. The details were chilling. The infant had been admitted with respiratory distress. Doctors had requested specialized equipment and an overnight intensive observation. Hospital administration had denied the request due to budgetary limitations. The baby had been sent home early. He died 2 days later. The board found procedural gaps but cited insufficient evidence for criminal negligence. The attending physician resigned 6 months later. No lawsuit was filed. The mother, apparently, never pursued legal action. Matthew stared at the screen, motionless. He knew without a doubt this was Rachel's child. A cold sensation slid through him, something heavier than guilt, something almost like horror. He had sat on the board of that very foundation. He had signed the grants. He had shaken hands with the hospital's director and smiled for the cameras. He had trusted the system he helped build, a system that had put numbers above life. Now he saw the cracks in that system, deep and fatal, like hairline fractures in a glass wall that only became visible after it shattered. Closing the laptop, he leaned back in his chair and pressed his hands against his face. The air felt thin. His wealth, his reputation, his influence, they had all been built on a platform of efficiency and power. But efficiency didn't comfort a grieving mother. Power didn't resurrect a dead child. It wasn't just that Rachel had suffered. It was that her suffering had been silently sponsored by people like him, people who never looked beyond the quarterly reports and the polished presentations. For the first time, Matthew didn't feel like a titan of industry. He felt like a man sitting in a room filled with ghosts he never meant to make. He looked out the window, but the skyline that once made him feel invincible now seemed hollow, distant, unreal. Somewhere out there, Rachel had gone to work, day after day, walking past his name on plaques, watching the world move on while she quietly survived. And in that moment, something inside him broke, not in a violent way, but in the slow, irreversible way a wall begins to crumble once the first stone is removed. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew he couldn't look away anymore. Not from Rachel. Not from the truth. Not from himself. It began with a question from Emily that Matthew didn't expect. They were sitting together on the living room floor, surrounded by puzzle pieces and the soft hum of classical music. Emily had been quieter than usual all week, no outbursts, no whining, but also no laughter. She was focused, almost careful in how she moved, like someone afraid of breaking something fragile that couldn't be fixed again. She looked up at him suddenly, holding a puzzle piece in her small hand, and asked, "Can we see the lady again?" He didn't understand at first. "What lady?" "The one who hugged me when I fell. The one who smelled like lemons." Her voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something more than childish curiosity. Matthew stared at her, the memory of Rachel's arms wrapped tightly around his daughter flashing back with vivid intensity. "I don't know if that's a good idea, sweetheart," he said slowly. "She made me feel safe," Emily whispered. That night, he sat with that sentence echoing in his mind like a bell. He had built a fortress around his daughter, security, nannies, the best private education money could buy, but she had found safety in a stranger's arms. A woman who had nothing to offer except presence and warmth. He didn't understand it, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, he called Rachel again. He offered to meet in a neutral place, somewhere public, somewhere safe. She agreed, though cautiously. They met in a quiet corner of a community library not far from where she lived. Rachel wore the same uniform, but this time, she carried herself differently, as if expecting to be judged. Matthew brought Emily with him. The moment Emily saw her, she ran across the room without hesitation and buried herself in Rachel's legs. Rachel bent down instinctively, wrapping her arms around her, no questions asked, just presence. Matthew watched them with a strange tightness in his throat. There was no pretense in Rachel, no performance. She just was, a stillness Emily had clearly gravitated toward like a compass finding north. They stayed in that corner for nearly an hour. Rachel read Emily a story. They laughed quietly over mispronounced words and silly voices. Matthew didn't interrupt. He simply watched. Afterward, he walked Rachel back to the train. As they stood on the sidewalk, waiting for the light to change, he finally asked the question that had been circling his mind for days. How did you do that? How did you get her to trust you so fast? Rachel didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the traffic. I didn't get her to do anything. She felt something in me. Kids, they know when someone's been broken. They understand it, even if they can't name it. Maybe she recognized it. Matthew was quiet. Then he said something he never imagined he would say to a woman who scrubbed floors in his office building. I want to help you. Rachel turned her head slowly. Why? Because I think you've helped my daughter more than I have in months. And because I owe you more than an apology. She hesitated, narrowing her eyes. Are you offering me charity? No, he said. I'm offering you an opportunity. Education. Housing. Whatever you need to move forward. You deserve more than a mop and silence. Rachel shook her head with a tired smile. I've been offered help before. Usually with a catch. Or a spotlight. Or pity. There's no catch, he said, and for once, he meant it. But she still said no. I don't want to be someone's redemption project. I did what I did because a little girl was crying. That's it. That's all. They stood in silence for a long time, the city moving around them in waves. Finally, Rachel stepped toward the train steps and paused. Your daughter's special, she said. Don't smother that. Don't protect her so much that she can't feel the world. It'll hurt her. Let her feel it. Even the sadness. Maybe especially the sadness. Then she disappeared down the stairs. Matthew stood there long after she had gone, the cold wind biting at his coat. He had tried to do what rich men do, solve things with resources. But Rachel had reminded him of something brutal and honest, that some wounds can't be fixed by offers. Some people don't need saving. They need seeing. And for the first time in his life, Matthew Harris realized he didn't know how to see someone unless they were wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, or asking for money. Rachel wasn't asking for anything. She had only given. And somehow, his daughter had understood that long before he did. The backlash came faster than Matthew could have anticipated. It started with a single article posted by a low-tier online tabloid known more for gossip than journalism, but the headline was designed to ignite outrage: Billionaire CEO's daughter found in janitor's arms, security breach or negligence. At first, he ignored it. Noise like that usually vanished in a few days. But this time, it didn't. Within 48 hours, larger outlets picked up the story. Headlines shifted tones, some skeptical, others scandalized, and a few accusatory. Photos of Rachel, taken without her knowledge as she walked to work or exited the train, appeared beside shots of Emily from past charity events. The contrast was cruelly intentional. Matthew tried to contain the damage. His PR team released a statement calling the incident a moment of human compassion mischaracterized by a media hungry for scandal. But it was too late. Social media spiraled into chaos. Strangers speculated about Rachel's intentions, labeled her a threat, and accused Matthew of endangering his child by allowing someone unqualified near her. A smear campaign followed. Commentators dissected Rachel's past like vultures: foster care, teen pregnancy, low income, the death of her child. The tragedy that should have earned her compassion instead became ammunition against her. The janitorial company that employed Rachel quickly caved under pressure. She was suspended pending further investigation. Her landlord, worried about press outside the building, gave her notice. Anonymous threats began to arrive in her inbox, ugly messages, full of hate and fear, accusing her of being a manipulator, an opportunist, even a danger to children. She lost 2 of her part-time evening jobs within the same week. And the worst blow of all came when a caseworker from Family Services arrived at her door to inform her that a formal inquiry had been opened regarding her interactions with a minor. It was absurd, and she knew it. But the process itself was punishment. When Matthew found out, he drove to her neighborhood himself. No driver. No security. Just him. He found Rachel sitting on the front steps of a crumbling walk-up building with a paper eviction notice still taped to the door behind her. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for help. She looked up at him with an expression he couldn't fully name, something tired, raw, and burning with quiet defiance. "This is my fault," he said. "I should have protected you." "No," she replied calmly. "This is what happens when someone like me touches someone like her. The world doesn't know how to handle it." He sat beside her in silence. The air was cold. The sky overcast. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Matthew said, almost to himself, "I spent my whole life building systems. And every one of them just failed the best person I've met." Rachel didn't answer, but her silence agreed with him. Later that week, during a press conference intended to launch a new product, Matthew did something no one expected. He stepped up to the podium, ignored the teleprompter, and spoke from the gut. He admitted that one of the hospitals supported by his foundation had failed a young mother and her infant son. He admitted that his company, through layers of bureaucracy and indifference, had become part of a machine that allowed that failure to go unpunished. Then, without naming Rachel directly, he condemned the attacks against her. He said that compassion should not be a liability. That dignity should not depend on income. And that the ability to comfort a child in pain was not something that required a resume, only a heart. The board was livid. Investors panicked. Stocks dipped. Internal emails flew like sparks in a dry forest. But Matthew didn't back down. When asked by a reporter if he was worried about losing control of his company, he responded with quiet finality, "If that's the cost of doing the right thing, then maybe it's time I paid it." And he did. Within days, the board convened an emergency session and voted to remove him as CEO. Shareholders watched with open mouths as the man who built Harris Tech from the ground up was forced to step down. He handed over his badge, cleared his office, and walked out without fanfare. The only thing he took with him was a photo of Emily from his desk. He went home that night not to a skyscraper or a private jet, but to a modest rental in Brooklyn where he sat across from Rachel at a table too small for his old world. She poured him a cup of tea. Neither of them spoke for a long while. When he finally looked up at her, she said something that stunned him more than all the headlines. "You didn't lose anything worth keeping." And somehow, he believed her. In the weeks after Matthew's public resignation, the noise around the scandal faded, but the consequences remained like bruises beneath the surface. News cycles moved on, the headlines replaced by fresher scandals, shinier betrayals, and louder collapses. Yet for Matthew, life didn't return to normal, it couldn't. His name was no longer attached to the daily performance of the company he had once built from scratch. His face was no longer printed on shareholder reports or projected on giant screens at industry summits. The invitations stopped coming. Former allies went silent. His phone, once a constant buzz of demands and praise, became eerily quiet. He spent his mornings walking. Sometimes through the parks where Emily liked to chase squirrels, sometimes through neighborhoods he used to drive past without a thought. For the first time in years, he had space to feel the weight of things. He thought about the coldness of boardrooms, about the language of profit margins that once dictated his morality. Now, when he passed street vendors or watched a mother juggling groceries and a stroller, he didn't see economic abstractions. He saw people. The invisible fabric he used to overlook had texture now: pain, survival, resilience, quiet kindness. Rachel, meanwhile, moved into a small apartment with the help of a community organization Matthew had quietly funded, though she didn't know that at first. She was still working part-time, mostly evenings, and attending free online courses that required more patience than she thought she had left. Emily visited often. Matthew never forced it. It just happened. The girl would draw pictures for Rachel and ask when they could see her again. When Emily was with Rachel, she seemed freer, lighter, as if something inside her had finally begun to heal. One chilly morning in December, Matthew stood in front of a decaying brick building in East Harlem, an old recreation center that had long been abandoned. The inside was gutted, full of dust and broken glass. It had been on the city's demolition list for years. But Matthew saw something in its bones. Not just a building. A possibility. 6 months later, it reopened under a new name, the Morris Center for Mothers and Children. It wasn't flashy. No ribbon-cutting ceremony, no celebrity endorsements. Just a place where struggling mothers could find day care, mental health services, job placement support, or simply a warm room where someone would listen. It was named not in charity, but in respect, for a woman who had nothing to give but gave anyway. Rachel didn't want the center named after her. She protested it at first. But when she walked through the finished halls for the first time and saw murals painted by local artists, classrooms filled with donated books, and a wall of framed photographs of real mothers and children from the neighborhood, she cried quietly. It wasn't her name that moved her. It was the feeling that for once, the world had made space for people like her. Matthew didn't return to tech. He was offered roles, consultancies, board positions, but he declined each one. He spent his time mentoring at the center, giving lectures at small colleges about ethics and leadership, and writing essays that no longer aimed to please shareholders, but to reach people who had once felt unseen. His relationship with Emily shifted too. He was no longer the distracted father balancing bedtime stories with business calls. Now, he made her pancakes badly but with effort. He read to her every night. He let her see him make mistakes, and more importantly, he let her see him change. One evening, as summer softened the edges of the city, Rachel invited Matthew and Emily to a small backyard barbecue hosted by one of the mothers from the center. The table was uneven, the plastic chairs mismatched, and the lemonade slightly too sweet. But there was laughter. Kids played. People shared stories. No one asked Matthew what he used to do. No one seemed to care. They just saw him as a man who showed up, who listened, who carried the grill when it needed lifting. At the end of the night, as they packed leftovers into foil and wiped spilled juice off the patio, Rachel looked at him across the table. There was something new in her eyes, not guardedness, not pity, not skepticism. Something softer. Trust, maybe. Or forgiveness. Or just the quiet knowledge that, against all odds, two people from opposite ends of the world had met somewhere in the middle, and neither had walked away unchanged. By the time another full year passed, the rhythms of life for both Matthew and Rachel had settled into something quiet, steady, and completely different from the lives they had known before. Rachel was now in the final year of her psychology degree, balancing online classes and in-person training hours at a local clinic. It wasn't easy. There were nights she barely slept, juggling textbooks and appointments, and there were moments when the old voices in her mind whispered that she didn't belong in this world of professionals and therapists and neatly organized paperwork. But she kept going. Not out of pride or obligation, but because she finally saw a future worth walking toward, one that wasn't defined by survival but by choice. Emily was thriving. Her teachers said she had become more engaged, more expressive, and more confident in herself. At 7, she was still young enough to believe in magic but old enough to understand loss, and somewhere in between, she had carved out her own language of trust and connection. She had begun drawing pictures of our house that always included 3 figures: herself, her father, and Rachel. Sometimes a cat too, though they didn't have one. Whenever Matthew asked why Rachel was always in the pictures, Emily would answer with the kind of innocence that disarmed everything: because she belongs with us. Matthew had spent most of that year trying to stay out of the spotlight. The man who had once lived inside endless schedules, airports, and meetings now spent his time helping Emily with school projects and volunteering at the Morris Center. He no longer carried the pressure of being a symbol of success. What mattered now was smaller but more honest: being present, being useful, being real. He learned how to fix leaking sinks, how to sit through a community board meeting without checking his phone, and how to apologize without defending himself. In early spring, the Morris Center hosted its first Family Day, a small event meant to bring together the mothers, children, volunteers, and staff who had built the center from the ground up. There were folding tables set up in the back garden, balloons tied to rusted fences, paper signs with hand-drawn letters, and homemade food stretching across every available surface. There was music too, and kids running barefoot through the grass while tired mothers laughed over lemonade and potato salad. Emily spent most of the afternoon glued to Rachel's side, helping her hand out juice boxes and organize coloring books. At some point, a boy scraped his knee, and Rachel knelt down with her usual calm, tending to him with practiced tenderness. Emily stood beside her, watching quietly, and then did something no one expected. She reached out, took Rachel's hand, and said in a voice that carried just loud enough to be heard by the small circle around them, "I wish you were my mommy." Everything stopped for a moment, not because it was awkward or shocking, but because it was real. Rachel's eyes widened, and Matthew, standing a few feet away, froze. The air seemed to hold still. Emily looked up, unfazed by the weight of her own words. "You already feel like a mommy," she added. "Just not the name part yet." Rachel glanced at Matthew. His face was unreadable, caught somewhere between pain and awe. They hadn't talked about this, about anything like this. There was no plan. No script. Only a little girl who had stitched her own understanding of love from the people who had shown up for her, again and again. Rachel knelt down to Emily's height. "That means more to me than anything," she said quietly, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly. "You're a very special girl, and I'm so lucky to know you." Emily didn't ask again. She didn't need to. Something had been spoken, and nothing about it needed correcting. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the last of the families said their goodbyes, Matthew and Rachel stood beside one another near the fence, watching Emily chase fireflies with another child. The glow of string lights flickered overhead, soft and golden. For a while, they just watched in silence, not needing to speak. Then, without turning to her, Matthew asked softly, "Do you ever think about starting again?" Rachel looked at him. "You mean, a family?" He nodded slowly. "I don't mean what people expect. I mean something that actually works. Something built with care." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know if I believe in starting over. But I believe in continuing forward. That feels more honest." He smiled at that, genuinely. "Would you let us keep walking with you?" She looked at him. "I never stopped." They left together, walking slowly down the sidewalk, Emily between them with one hand in each of theirs. And even though the city buzzed beyond them and the world remained imperfect and difficult and unpredictable, there was something complete in the simplicity of that moment: 3 people, no longer broken pieces, but a constellation forming its own quiet shape against the night. The first snow came late that year, falling quietly on a December morning that seemed too still, too delicate for anything hurried or harsh. The streets were layered in soft white, muffling the usual city sounds, and the breath of every passerby came out in clouds. Inside a modest house nestled in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood, lights were already glowing in the windows long before the sun fully rose. The living room was dressed in small decorations, paper snowflakes Emily had made herself, a slightly crooked tree decorated with handmade ornaments, a few twinkling lights strung carefully around the window frames. It wasn't extravagant, not like the towering trees or polished garlands Matthew had once commissioned for his penthouse, but it was warmer, truer, and completely theirs. The house smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee. Matthew stood at the kitchen stove, awkwardly flipping pancakes that were too thick on one side and undercooked on the other. He wore an old sweater with a thread coming loose at the sleeve and hummed off-key to the holiday music playing from the radio. Across the room, Rachel sat on the couch, barefoot, a mug of tea warming her hands as she smiled at the sight. Emily was sprawled on the rug, building a fort out of pillows and blankets, narrating her process as if she were hosting a home improvement show. Her laughter rose like sparks, filling the room with something that had taken years to reclaim, joy that didn't come with conditions. There was no schedule that morning. No meetings. No obligations. No pressure to be anywhere but right there, with one another. The snow continued to fall in slow, hypnotic spirals beyond the windows. It covered the lawn, the sidewalks, the cars parked along the street, as if trying to soften the world just a little more. After breakfast, they bundled up and went outside, their boots crunching through the powdery snow as they walked hand in hand to the park nearby. They weren't the only ones there, families and neighbors had come out, children dragging sleds behind them, dogs leaping excitedly through the drifts. Emily made snow angels with a girl from school while Rachel and Matthew stood under a tree, watching, talking quietly. Their conversations no longer had the tension of unspoken boundaries or guilt. They were simple now, about books, plans, memories, the future. They had become something more than allies, more than two people who had survived the wreckage of the past. They had become a team, a quiet unit stitched together by effort, not accident. Later, when the sky began to darken and fingers turned numb despite gloves, they returned home. Emily changed into warm pajamas and curled up with a blanket on the couch. Rachel lit candles along the windowsill, their golden light flickering against the glass. Matthew sat beside his daughter, a book open in his lap, and began to read. The words tumbled out slowly at first, but Emily listened with quiet eyes and a small smile. Rachel joined them a moment later, sitting on the other side, and pulled the blanket over all of them. For a while, there was no sound but Matthew's voice and the wind gently brushing against the windows. Then, without planning or even thinking about it, Emily leaned her head against Rachel's shoulder and said, "This feels like home." Rachel didn't answer right away. Her throat caught. She looked at Matthew, who met her gaze with a stillness that said everything he couldn't put into words. A few weeks later, on a quiet evening just before the new year, they sat at the kitchen table after Emily had gone to bed. The house was quiet again, the only sound the soft clink of spoons in mugs of tea. Rachel pulled a folded paper from her bag and slid it across the table. Matthew picked it up. It was an acceptance letter, her official placement for a clinical psychology residency, beginning in the spring. It was at the very center she had once walked into as a client years before. He looked up at her, his expression full of something deep and steady. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. She smiled, but it wasn't pride she wore on her face, it was something gentler, quieter. "I used to think I wasn't meant for anything like this. That some people were just meant to survive, not live." "You do both," he replied. "And you help other people do the same." They sat in silence again, not the uncomfortable kind but the sacred kind that only comes when people truly know one another. Then Rachel said, almost as an afterthought, "Emily asked me again last night if she could call me Mom." Matthew's breath caught. He searched her eyes. "What did you say?" "I said, not yet. But soon." Tears threatened the corners of his vision, but he didn't look away. She already sees you that way. I think I do too. There were no grand declarations. No dramatic music or sudden changes. Just two people sitting at a table, with history between them and the future slowly unfolding on the other side. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet and soft, as if the world were making peace with its own scars. On New Year's Day, they took a photo together in front of the fireplace. Emily in the middle, arms around them both. No titles, no roles. Just three people who had found each other in the wreckage of very different storms and decided to build something new from what remained. Sometimes, when angels fall, it is not a descent into ruin. It is a return to earth, where love, imperfect, human, healing, can finally reach them. This story isn't really about a billionaire or a janitor. It's about how two broken people, crushed by entirely different systems, found something sacred in the most unlikely of places, each other. The ending works not because it wraps everything in a bow, but because it dares to be quiet, honest, and human. There's no dramatic twist, no sudden miracle. Just healing, earned slowly, through choice, humility, and love that isn't grand but true. What makes the ending powerful is its restraint. Matthew doesn't get his empire back. Rachel doesn't become someone else's version of success. Instead, they build a life that's small, real, and rooted in presence. And for a world obsessed with spectacle, that's the most radical kind of happy ending there is.